So many deliveries, so little time. It's easy. Lala move it and send multiple deliveries at one go with a wide range of vehicles from motorcycles, cars, vans to lorries. Just connect your e-commerce storefront with our plugins and integrate your business with our API solutions. Save time and money with same-day on-demand delivery. Because in business, it's all about winning. Lala Move. Make a winning move today. Visit lalamove.com/winningmove.
This is a download from BFM 89.9, the business station.
Good morning. This is Psychology at Work on Visa Center. My name is Audrey Raj, and with me on the show, as always, is organizational psychologist and CEO of OPsych, Hetal Doshi. Apa khabar?
Super good. Thank you so much, Audrey. How are you?
I am doing good myself. On the show today, it is part 2 of our 5-part series on succession planning, and we are going to be discussing CEO myths and selection biases, and of course, what we can do about it. Now, Hetal, let's start with CEO myths, right? Why are we talking about CEO myths, and how does that relate to succession planning?
I think one of the major reasons why we're talking about this is because as organizations make a decision about who is going to succeed, there's a typical profile that comes out in their mind about who could succeed. However, this makes the pool a lot smaller because we do not consider all the other potential candidates or talent that could be out there. So I think my theme for today is what it takes to look the part and what it takes to deliver results may not be the same thing. So who you think will be the best candidate versus who could actually deliver the results may not eventually be the same person. And so the hope and the aim of this podcast would be to really open our minds and open up the selection pool for all of the candidates that could be quite valuable for this particular position. So actually also, before we get into this, one of the major reasons why this has become a topic is because the list of celebrity CEO failures are getting higher and bigger. So there are a lot of CEOs that have become, of celebrity status, the ones who come out on Twitter, the ones who come out on Facebook all the time, but they may not actually be succeeding. They might just be taking up a lot of noise in the social media platforms. And the research actually confirms these findings that the failure rate of a lot of celebrity executives are at 50% right now. And the picture of what makes success or what creates success is not necessarily what media portrays out to be. So shall we start with the myths, Audrey?
Yes, let's go. Let's get into it.
Okay, so number one, what about which university we graduate from? Does that mean that the better the university that we graduate from, or if we are Ivy Leaguers that we'll perform better as CEOs? So what do you think, Audrey?
I would think being an Ivy Leaguer would give you an advantage for sure, but I don't think it's necessary because we've seen some they start a business out of their parents' garage and they still succeed and become multi-billionaires, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yet as part of the selection criteria, it is typically a criteria to have a look at where they graduate from. And some people might say, yeah, that's just a criteria, but we don't really look at it. Then don't include it at all if that's not the most important thing. However, okay, let's look at some stats now. So 7% of the CEOs that were analyzed in this particular research graduated from an Ivy League college, whereas 8% of this pool of candidates of CEOs did not even complete college or actually even took an unusually long time to graduate. Ivy League graduates are more prevalent among the ranks of the Fortune 500 CEOs, but outside of this small set of the largest companies, there's a much broader range of educational backgrounds and pedigrees. So what this means is that within the top Fortune 500, we actually still see a lot more Ivy Leaguers. But outside of it, we have a lot more that are not necessarily Ivy Leaguers. So I can't really make a clear understanding about whether this is a bias and therefore more of them end up there. And so that means the pool has lesser Ivy Leaguers, and so they end up being CEOs of other companies. But in this particular research, 7% of CEOs graduated from Ivy League companies, and in that same pool, 8% never graduated from any college or took an unusually long time to graduate.
Right. Okay. What's the next myth, Ethel?
So there's another myth that CEOs are egotistical superheroes, right? Like that they're egotistical, or like they are, very materialistic, or that they are difficult to approach. So CEOs who saw independence, right, like the ability to be independent and the ability to score well independently, CEOs who define themselves as that, as their defining character trait, were twice as likely to underperform compared to other CEOs. So CEOs who use words like I at a much higher rate than we were twice as likely to underperform. And for many, many successful CEOs, this team orientation has its roots in early organized like sports and in mentoring others, which means that a lot of CEOs who did sports when they were younger or took part in mentoring other people, and they define themselves more as we and more as teams, actually ended up being more powerful, and therefore they continue to stay as CEOs as well. So it is not true that most CEOs are egotistical superheroes. It could be that most underperforming CEOs are egotistical, and they think of them as superheroes. So think about the leaders that you're talking to. Do they say I more? Do they say we more? Do they play sports, team sports in particular? And do they actually invest time in mentoring others? They would be the most successful ones out there. And we are definitely seeing a lot more great leaders out there, at least from my personal experience.
Okay, what's number 3, Hital?
So number 3 would be that CEOs are very extroverted. They're very larger than life. They're very charismatic, very confident. I think there is this general belief that CEOs would be a lot more extroverted and charismatic. They are so charismatic that they are like masters of the universe, and they're like glorified as if they were God, right? They are then taken and shown across all Hollywood films or on Netflix. Like, for example, you're seeing the who's who in Netflix right now, right? You're not seeing the ones who are quiet. Yeah. They're the ones who get like shown out there, but are they the only ones who are performing? Not necessarily. In fact, actually, when there was research done, a third of CEOs in studies describe themselves as introverted. And in this particular study, introverts were actually slightly more likely to exceed board's expectations. So introverted CEOs tend to actually exceed, or at least by slightly, the board members' expectations. And why do they do that? Is because they tend to signal, I'm not saying all of them do that, but introverts, or typically people who are willing to listen, tend to signal that sense of learning orientation, that I am here to, my confidence is in learning, my confidence isn't in talking and influencing, and I'm creating that. So when they looked at this data, there was statistically no difference found between introverts and extroverts. And high confidence doubles your advantage of being chosen as a CEO, but doesn't actually provide you an advantage in being a performer. Unfortunately, if you're confident and if you're extroverted, you are probably going to be picked more easily. But when it comes to performance, the introverts have a slight advantage, and confidence has no advantage once you are selected already. What they look at is not confidence in ability, but confidence in learning. And this is what everybody's looking out for. The sense that you are open and willing to learn is more important than you know everything.
Yeah, that makes sense. CEOs are, they're not egotistical superheroes per se. They don't have to be larger than life or have exceptional charisma and confidence. What's next?
CEOs are destined for greatness from an early age. So that thing of like, let's spot potential at a young age may not be true at all. In fact, 70% of CEOs that were identified in this study never ever set out themselves to be CEOs later on in life. And the only time that they begin to think about becoming a CEO was when they were within that level of reach. So it is about exposure towards that particular space in a hierarchy of an organization rather than, oh yeah, I would love to be a CEO. And typically after only about 15 to 20 years of experience, did they actually begin to feel that they would want to become a CEO and that they could maybe thrive in that particular role. So I think when organizations hire employees and immediately begin to categorize them as high potential talent, can become a very dangerous thing, because at that point in time, we may not even have exposed them enough for them to say, yeah, this is what I want. And when somebody wants something, obviously, it's going to be much easier for them to be excited about that role and potentially perform in that role as well. So no, parents, if you look at your kids and they're, able to organize the kitchen or cook something, please don't be like CEO in the making. That's like just really wrong. That's not CEO in the making. CEO in the making is someone who's been there, done that for about 15 years, and they actually begin to see, oh my God, yes, this is something that I feel is very much part of my field right now.
Okay, it is time for us to take a quick break. But when we come back, we get into the remaining 6 CEO myths as well as selection biases when it comes to selecting your next CEO. All that and more happening on Psychology at Work on Resource Center. Stay tuned, BFM 89.9.
Balanced Frank Medium, BFM 89.9.
You are listening to Resource Center. This is Audrey Raj. It is episode 13 of our Psychology at Work series. And on this episode, we are talking about CEO myths and selection biases. Now, Hetal, what are the myths are there?
You know how we all write resumes and stuff like that, right? So obviously at every juncture, we want to see that, yeah, we've succeeded every step and milestone in our life, but that's actually not true. In fact, the reality is that 45% of CEOs had at least one major career blow up that ended their jobs or was extremely costly to the business. And so that idea that, oh yeah, failure is something that we are willing to look at actually needs to be implemented as well, because majority of the top CEOs have had 45%, not majority, 45% have at least had one major career blow up. Yet maybe 78% of these people who have failed and created a massive missed opportunity for themselves, 78% of losers, if you call them that, people who have lost jobs, actually eventually went on to become some of the best CEOs as well. So it wasn't that CEOs, what sets successful CEOs apart is not the lack of mistakes, but sometimes maybe it's because they made those mistakes, that level of anger, that level of motivation, that level of like, I need to prove myself, that level of compounded energy propels them to do something even more incredible. And so, it can be a big bias that happens when it comes to making decisions about CEOs, that some people say, yeah, but they failed before. But unfortunately in this data, CEOs who talk about a blow up are actually, more than 78% more likely to deliver the next strongest performance as CEO.
Right, because failure also makes us human. Exactly.
Yeah.
All right. What's next then? What's our next myth?
Yeah. So what about female CEOs, right? So female CEOs succeed differently from men, but they succeed anyway. Yeah. I think one of the saddest things again is that only about, I think as of right now, maybe about 4 to 6% of the largest companies are led by female CEOs. And in fact, female CEOs and male CEOs are actually not different. They don't succeed differently. They actually succeed the same way, but it is interpreted in a totally different way. For example, if a male is aggressive, then a female is, I can't use the word here, but she's not allowed to be aggressive. The way her aggression is interpreted in a way that results in defamation of sorts of her reputation, and it becomes like, oh, she just cannot handle the pressure. So the myth is that female CEOs are different from male CEOs, but it's not. They're essentially the same, but their behaviors are interpreted in a way that is unfortunately not so helpful for women as they then become less likable from the interpretation of their behaviors.
Right. What's
Yeah.
next? We are on myth number 7.
Another myth is that CEOs excel in any situation, and that's obviously wrong. I think the idea that CEOs can excel in any context, in any situation, at any point in time, because they are, the hallmarks of excellence is absolutely wrong. So therefore, when a CEO is thinking, or when you are thinking about which CEO will take on your organization, it is important about considering their identity and what kind of situations work with that particular identity. So if they are CEOs that are very good at turnarounds, then put them more in situations that are turning around businesses. If they're CEOs or their identities about relationship building, then you probably want to, make sure that you put them in these kind of situations. But if you want somebody who, you can't put a wrong identity in a wrong situation. You need to identify the right identity that is required for that particular situation. Yeah. So not all CEOs will be the best fit. It all depends on the context and therefore the identity that they have in being able to succeed in that particular context, if that makes sense.
Okay. So we have 3 more to go. What is our 8th myth?
CEOs work harder than us. I think sometimes we have that thing that, CEOs work very, very hard, but that's not necessarily the case. The analysis showed that there is no prediction between how hard a leader worked and how likely he was to become a CEO. So hard work is not necessarily CEO, criteria of CEOs. It's more important what they do with their time, and their time should be all utilized as much as possible about thinking, strategizing, and rallying. It's not about working hard. It's really about minimizing the negative work ethics. Which could be like, treating people poorly or not paying them well. So making sure that you use your time to remove or negate any terrible work ethics, that would be a better use of your time rather than working hard. Yeah. Another one is that, a CEO requires experience, but the shocking findings that we had in this particular research was that CEOs were statistically no less likely to meet or exceed expectations than those with prior CEO experience. So sometimes maybe your experience could work to your disadvantage as well. So not having experience in this particular study showed that you were not necessarily likelier or less likely to succeed compared to somebody who had experience. I don't think that means that we go around like making sure that we hire inexperienced people for CEOs, but if you find that a candidate is extremely suitable, but they may not have experience, then do not discount the fact that they may not be able to perform at that capacity whatsoever, because it's just like an intern, right? Like you've never had the experience, but you still perform at the end of the day. Some perform, some don't perform as well. Yeah.
Okay. And we are on our final myth now.
Yeah, I think the level of IQ, right? So is it important for this person to have very high levels of IQ? And this is something that was rebutted earlier, that it is not necessarily that leaders with higher levels of intelligence, as measured by standardized intelligence scores, does not increase their odds of becoming a CEO, and definitely doesn't increase the odds of performing well. In fact, CEOs who cut to the chase and speak in very clear, simple, non-bombastic language, compared to those with, complex cerebral vocabulary. And right now we're working with some clients that their vocabulary is so bombastic that nobody else can understand what they're talking about except for themselves and the fellow Ivy Leaguers. And there's a lot of time invested in translating what that actually means from a layman's perspective, or at least an average man's perspective, has actually led to us finding out from that particular organization, the majority of them saying, we simply do not like the CEO because we cannot even understand this person, and this person is way too bombastic. We are not. They're in one tail end of it. We are on the other spectrum. So it is a case of me versus you rather than a case of we. Intelligence is still very important. IQ is still very important, but more importantly is to make sure that you are able to be understood and connected with everybody around you. Yeah.
Right, Hetal, we have a few minutes before we have to take another quick break. I know we've been talking about all these CEO myths, but do you have like a case study or some examples of some unlikely CEOs that have actually made it, that have actually proved themselves and are an excellent example of a success story?
Yeah, I really like this particular story because it's just such a down to earth story, literally down to earth story. So this is a story about Don Slager, the CEO of Republic Services, which is a recycling and waste services business. So Don grew up in a blue collar community. He was surrounded by like welders, truck drivers, steel mill workers, and he went to a high school with aspirations to become a builder, but like graduated into like what they call a bum market for construction. So like just basically, one of those that just gets handpicked to do construction. And he started his career driving a garbage truck and clocked in at 3:45 a.m. endured the thankless monotony of his job and the horrible stench that kind of came with that. Did 10 to 12 hour shifts every week, collected his paycheck at the end of it, and prepared himself to start the routine over and over again for the next few years. But because of the way that he actually was somehow, because he showed up every day and he planted these seeds of like unwavering reliability, and which is something that we'll talk about later. One of the most key attributes of successful CEOs, the reliability and learnability. So I'm learning and I'm reliable at every juncture. He began to have like this pervasive reputational success. So he ended up becoming a story over and over again because of the unique things and the unique ways that he used to do things. And then he began to become noticed by very powerful mentors who began to see things in him and then started to position him at higher positions. And he was then through his behavior and character propelled to be chosen as the CEO of this organization, which is a Fortune 500 powerhouse in the waste services industry, generating $9 billion in revenue. And during his time as a leader, he got this organization to outperform between 2012 and 2016 of sorts. And the market cap of his organization doubled from about 1.15 billion to about 22 billion during his time. And not only his performance was so incredible, but he was also received a Glassdoor Employees' Choice Award and was named Glassdoor's 2017 highest rated CEO, or he was put in that particular list. Now, I'm sure, I do not like to say CEOs are gods and do not want to put him as like, or, someone to be worshipped and whose feet should be worshipped on. That's not the case, but it is an extremely unlikely CEO with no experience of being a CEO, with no education of being that. I'm not saying that this is a story that would meet every company's, standard story of sorts. But this is obviously an organization where they were able to see potential from a very, very unique angle. And maybe having that person not have experience from a CEO lens, but from a service lens, help to propel the entire company, but also maintain the level of culture and engagement that the workforce needed as well. So definitely everything that we spoke about earlier, this guy has gone against the grain and succeeded. And I think we need to really reevaluate what success can look like.
Right. Okay, it is time for another quick break. But when we come back, we get into selection biases and what we can do about it. You are listening to Psychology at Work on Resource Center. Stay tuned, BFM 89.9.
Be free-minded. BFM 89.9, the business station.
We're back. You are listening to Psychology at Work on Resource Center. It is part 2 of our 5-part series on succession planning. And we are discussing selection biases, when selecting your new CEO. Now, Hetal, for the break, we kind of discussed gender bias and similar like me bias and confirmation bias as well, as part of the some of the myths that people have about who a CEO should be, or where a CEO should come from, or what kind of skills CEO should have. But maybe we can backtrack a little bit and talk about bias itself and why biases should be addressed.
So biases is usually unconscious. It happens outside of our control and is automatically and triggered within split seconds by our brain in order to make quick judgments and assessments of people and situations. And the reason why it's quick is because it's influenced by our own personal background, our own personal environment, and our own personal experiences. So I love that you've talked about similar to me bias, because this is what a major bias when it comes to selection would be. So major bias would be a similar to me. I pick somebody who's like me, and I like people who are like me. I can see so much of semblance of you in me, and therefore you would be successful because I would hope to think that I am successful, and therefore someone like me would be as well. Do we see this happening in the workplace? All the time, because we do not have eradicate identities from resumes. So the moment the person's identity is there, it already triggers a lot of things, like knowing a person's name. Like, for example, a Paul or John would be more likely than a Zachary, for example, or a Muthu or an Ali, right? So we do not eradicate these identities. And so we are immediately able to identify or at least attach identification to a person because our resumes have that. And that's wrong. Most resumes, or when we talk about conversations about people, when we have conversations about candidates, they should be de-identified, but it's very difficult to do that. However, it can. Just because it's difficult doesn't mean it cannot. Now, the moment that happens, what happens is that we kind of, because the CEO or candidate of CEOs are pretty small, so it is likely that we would already know who that person is and begin to have a lot of different types of biases. There are different types of biases, like, for example, similar to me, like we talked about earlier, or I think groupthink is a very, very challenging one. Groupthink would be the loudest voices typically would propel everybody to kind of come to a consensus about who might be the best candidate. And then for the fear of speaking out, people just go along with that as well. And again, the loudest in the room doesn't mean you are the rightest in the room of sorts, right? So these biases can be, have been one of the major triggers when we do, when we run surveys in organizations. We ask them, like, why do you think you didn't get the promotion? And most people say favoritism. There's kind of a favoritism over here. So what can we do about it?
Are there tips to kind of reduce the impact of bias? Because, it is an unknown. We don't realize, we're not mindful about these biases, right? And so is there a way to reduce the impact of bias when making a selection?
Sure. Yeah. I think when it comes to shortlisting, surely, try to de-identify the person. In one particular study, when they had two study groups, one where they knew the names of the candidates. When they knew the names of the candidates, they selected the males more often and more quickly. But when they didn't know, they actually selected at random, either male or female. And we found that the candidates that were chosen were either male or female. So when you know, it is very likely that you're going to choose, in that particular study, it is more likely that you're going to choose a male. It's very likely, more likely that you're going to choose a tall person, a good-looking person, so on and so forth. So focus on minimal required qualifications, technical skill sets, maybe even beauty and stuff like that. Very difficult, but yeah, try to do that. Something that studies do would be to put a curtain around it. So they put a curtain and they kind of auto-bot the speaker. So when this person speaks, you cannot tell whether it's male or female, and then you kind of go through. So you put them under the same assessment, but you cannot see who they are. You do not know who you are evaluating, and then you make a decision from there as well. Also, when it comes to diversity and inclusion, depending on what your organization wants, make sure that you have the quota that is met for both parties. Like if it's, I don't know, if you're looking at, gender diversity, then make sure you have both gender. If you're looking at age diversity, maybe you have all. If you're looking at national diversity or identity diversity, then have all of that. But make sure you have the numbers there, which means that you may or may not have competent candidates, but you have all of the different diverse portfolios that you're looking at. Shortlisting people who are shortlisting the candidates should not have access to demographic information. Also, because of first impression biases, it is important to balance that out by questioning your first impression and leaving that out of the way. So, for example, once you do your evaluation, you ask each other, okay, what was your first impression? Okay, my first impression was blah, blah, blah. Now, okay, given that was your first impression, let's now eradicate that whole part and what was the rest of your impression of that person. So that could be quite important. And lastly, also, I think what was very valuable with a particular group that we worked with was to give them a bias test. So all the board members that were selecting went through a unconscious bias test so that they could understand and be accountable to the fact that, because once you complete a bias test, you will realize that everybody is biased, right? Before that, you'll be like, Mola, where God, I'm not biased, right? So once they do the assessment, then they will find out that, yes, I do have some elements of biasness, and my biasness is around either gender or either around nationality or whatever, and then be accountable to that. So that's the shortlisting part. Yeah, that would be some of the. I think what's really fun is what's most fun is the bias test that board members can and should do, because there's so much learning that takes place in that. And they then begin to have the language to call each other out as well. So that's a pretty fun process at the start. Yeah.
Okay. Wow. Okay. So this was a jam-packed session. We've covered the myths. We have covered the biases. So I guess next up on episode 3, we will be discussing the secrets to selecting a great CEO. You want to give us a bit of a tease before next month's episode, Hetal?
Oh, that they are no secret. I'm just joking. The biggest one would be, I think the biggest secret for CEO selection is nothing except, well, there's a lot, but really focusing on the pivot. Like, what is the transformation that you want that CEO to make without killing the organization in the process or sabotaging what is great about the organization. So pivot will be a very important part, and how do you craft out that sentence will be something that we'll talk about the next one.
And so that will be happening on part 3 of our 5-part series coming up same time next month. Thank you, Hetal, for taking the time to share these insights with us. For more information on the work you do, where can our listeners go? Maybe you can give them your website and your LinkedIn as well.
Yeah, sure. You can find me on Hetal Doshi at LinkedIn, which is HETAL and DOSHI. And I know that the podcast has been aired when I suddenly get like a flood of messages on LinkedIn. So thank you to those who listen and obviously get in touch as well. Appreciate that.
Right. I've been speaking with Hetal Doshi, organizational psychologist and CEO of OPSych. My name is Audrey Raj, and this has been Psychology at Work on Resource Center, BFM 89.9.
Thank you for listening to this podcast. To find more great interviews, go to bfm.my or find us on iTunes. BFM 89.9, the business station.